The lights shimmered over the long dining table, but the air was ice-cold. Everyone laughed, everyone except Kofi. His mother, Mabel, stood at the head of the table, glass of red wine in hand, her voice dripping with mockery. "Out of all my children," she announced, smiling bitterly, "Kofi is the most useless one we have. A man who adds no value to this family." Laughter erupted from his siblings and her friends. Kofi sat still, his eyes steady, not angry, not broken, just quiet. Because the one thing none of them knew, not his boastful brother, not his greedy mother, was that every plate on that table, every chandelier light above their heads, every brick of that mansion was paid for by the useless son they mocked. That night would be the last time Mabel called him useless, because before the evening ended, she'd realize her entire lifestyle existed because of him. Kofi was the middle son in a rich but broken family. His mother, Mabel, loved to show off her other children, Kwame and Amma. Kwame was loud and proud, always talking about his job at the bank. Amma was elegant and stylish, the perfect daughter in everyone's eyes. But when it came to Kofi, Mabel's face always changed. She called him lazy, useless, and a disappointment because he didn't live like the rest of them. He didn't wear designer clothes, didn't attend rich parties, and never tried to impress anyone. Kofi liked peace. He lived simply, keeping to himself and never arguing. When his mother insulted him, he just smiled softly. Everyone thought he was a failure, who couldn't make anything of his life. They had no idea he had quietly built something powerful. While they laughed at him, Kofi was working day and night in another country, creating a logistics company that became one of the biggest in Africa. He used a different name so no one would ever connect it to him. When his father died, the family almost lost everything. Mabel cried about her bills, her house, and her social image. She told everyone that a kind sponsor had helped her rebuild her life. What she never knew was that her sponsor was her own son, the same one she looked down on. Every month, Kofi sent money through an anonymous trust fund. The mansion she bragged about, the cars she drove, even Amma's tuition abroad, all came from the money Kofi secretly provided. He never told anyone. He didn't want praise or attention. He just wanted his mother and siblings to live comfortably, even if they never respected him. Deep inside, though, every insult left a small scar. Each time she called him useless, he wanted to tell her the truth, that the useless son was the reason she could hold her fancy parties and show off to her friends. But Kofi stayed silent. He believed that time would one day reveal everything. While his brother and sister lived off fake pride, Kofi kept building quietly, expanding his company across countries. No one noticed him, but the world was already learning his name, just not the one his family knew. Kofi wasn't useless. He was simply hidden. The silent strength behind a family built on lies. The mansion was glowing that evening. Expensive lights hung from the ceiling, and soft music played as guests arrived in shiny cars. Mabel had planned a big dinner to celebrate her daughter Amma's engagement to a rich doctor. The table was filled with gold plates, fine wine, and food that could feed a whole village. Everyone was dressed beautifully, taking pictures and praising Mabel for raising such successful children. When Kofi walked in quietly, wearing a simple black shirt, all eyes turned to him. His mother forced a smile and said loudly, "Ah, the quiet one finally showed up." Some guests laughed softly. Kofi greeted everyone politely and sat at the end of the table. He didn't talk much, but his calm presence bothered Mabel. She wanted him there for one reason, to make him look small next to his siblings. As dinner went on, Mabel began her show. She bragged about Kwame's promotion at the bank and Amma's upcoming wedding. Then she looked at Kofi and said, "And my dear son Kofi, well, what do you even do these days?" Her voice was sweet but full of poison. The guests laughed, thinking it was a joke. Kofi looked up and simply said, "I'm doing fine, Mom." But Mabel didn't stop. "Fine," she repeated loudly. "You're a man with no ambition. Look at your brother, successful. Look at your sister, marrying a doctor. You're the only one who brings nothing to this family." Everyone went silent for a moment, unsure how to react. Then nervous laughter filled the room. Kwame smirked, Amma looked embarrassed, and Mabel enjoyed the attention. Kofi didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just sat still, his eyes calm but distant. Inside, his heart ached, but his pride stayed firm. He knew they were laughing at the same person who paid for the chandelier above their heads, the car Mabel arrived in, and the mansion they were dining in. But he didn't need to prove anything yet. He looked at his mother, gave a faint smile, and said softly, "You'll find out soon enough." Mabel frowned, not understanding what he meant. The guests returned to their laughter, thinking he was just being dramatic. But Kofi knew that this dinner, the night meant to humiliate him, would one day be remembered for something else entirely. Because soon, the truth about who really built their comfort would change everything. Far from his family's judgment and their loud, shiny world, Kofi lived a quiet, simple life. He rented a small apartment in the city, wore plain shirts, and drove an old car that sometimes refused to start. His neighbors saw him as a humble man who minded his own business, always polite, always calm. Nobody would ever guess that behind that quiet face was one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. Kofi had built something big, something he never bragged about. His company, Kovalink Transports, had become one of the top logistics and export businesses in Africa. Every day, hundreds of trucks and ships moved goods across borders under his company's name. But few people knew who the real owner was, because Kofi worked under another identity. He didn't want fame or applause. He only wanted peace and purpose. With the money he earned, Kofi didn't chase luxury. He helped people. He built schools in small villages where children once studied under trees. He supported orphanages and paid for hospital renovations in poor towns. Every donation came from the Mensa Foundation, a name he created to hide himself. He wanted the world to change because of kindness, not recognition. Meanwhile, his mother, Mabel, was living like a queen. Her mansion stood tall on a quiet hill, filled with imported furniture and expensive art. She hosted charity galas, wore designer dresses, and drove a brand new car that turned heads everywhere she went. Everyone in her social circle believed she had a mysterious foreign sponsor, a generous man who funded all her projects and expenses. Mabel loved that story. It made her feel powerful, admired, and important. But the truth was painful and ironic. That foreign sponsor was none other than her own son, the same man she mocked, insulted, and called useless. After his father's death, when the family nearly went bankrupt, it was Kofi who had quietly set up the anonymous account that kept his mother's life running. Every luxury she bragged about came from the same person she tried to shame. Still, Kofi said nothing. He never wanted her gratitude. All he ever wanted was to see his family live well, even if they never respected him. While Mabel posed for pictures in the mansion he paid for, Kofi sat alone in his small apartment, smiling quietly, knowing that true power doesn't always need to be seen. A week after the embarrassing dinner, Kofi was at home, sitting quietly on his small couch, reading through business reports on his old laptop. His apartment was simple, no fancy decorations, no air of wealth, just peace. Then, without warning, his door burst open. It was his mother, Mabel, dressed in expensive clothes and an angry expression. She didn't even greet him. She walked straight in, dropped her designer bag on the table, and began shouting his name. "Kofi, I need money," she said sharply. "Amma's wedding is in 2 months, and we have so many things to pay for. The hall, the dress, the food, everything costs a lot, and you have to contribute. Don't embarrass this family again." Kofi looked up slowly, calm as always. "Mom," he said gently, "I'm sorry, but I can't help this time. You've already spent enough on Amma's wedding. Maybe it's time to plan within your means." Mabel froze for a second, then burst into loud laughter. "Within my means," she shouted. "You think I can let my daughter marry like a poor girl? You will help, you owe this family that much." But Kofi stayed still. "I don't owe anyone, Mom," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Those words hit her like a slap. Her face twisted with anger. "You're the most useless child I've ever had," she screamed. "You sit here doing nothing while your siblings bring honor to this family. I regret ever giving birth to you." The words cut deep. For a moment, Kofi just stared at her. The same woman he had been silently helping for years. The same woman whose house, car, and social life were built on his money. Yet she still saw him as worthless. His chest tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out. Then he turned to her and said in a calm, steady tone, "You'll soon see what you've built your pride upon." Mabel frowned, confused. "What do you mean by that?" But Kofi didn't answer. He picked up her bag, handed it to her politely, and opened the door. "Good night, Mom." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, still shouting about how ungrateful he was. But Kofi just stood there in silence. Something inside him had changed. That night, he decided it was time for the truth to speak louder than her insults. Time for her to finally see who she had been calling useless all her life. After his mother's cruel words, Kofi decided it was time to stop hiding. He didn't shout or seek revenge. He simply made a quiet plan, one that no one would see coming. For years, he had been sending money through hidden accounts, keeping his mother's world shining and stable. Now he decided to take back everything that rightfully belonged to him. One night, Kofi sat at his small desk and opened his laptop. With a few careful clicks, he began transferring all his assets back into his real name. The anonymous accounts that once paid for Mabel's mansion, car, and parties were slowly being closed. Every document, every fund, every property, all shifted under his name. When the last transfer was complete, Kofi leaned back and took a deep breath. It was not anger that drove him, but peace. He had finally decided to let his silence speak. Days later, the first signs began to show. Mabel's bank called to report an issue with her account. The funds that usually arrived at the start of every month hadn't come. She ignored it, thinking it was just a delay. But then the bills started to pile up. The housekeeper asked for her salary. Mabel couldn't pay. The electricity company sent warnings. She brushed them off. Within 2 weeks, the mansion's lights went out in the middle of a dinner she was hosting. Guests whispered, embarrassed. As the room went dark, Mabel grew frustrated. She called her bank again, her sponsors, and every friend who ever claimed to have business connections. No one had answers. The payments had simply stopped. The next morning, her luxury car was taken away by the dealership. Unpaid installments. One by one, her staff started leaving. The gardener, the driver, the cook, all gone. The woman who once lived like royalty was suddenly surrounded by silence. In her confusion, Mabel sat in her grand living room, sweating under the heat because the power had been cut. Her phone kept ringing with unpaid bills. She couldn't understand what was happening. Why would they stop helping me? She muttered again and again, pacing across the room. She didn't know that the they she was talking about had always been one person, Kofi. The same son she had mocked and insulted. While Mabel's world began to crumble, Kofi remained calm. He didn't visit her or call. He just watched quietly from a distance, knowing this was not revenge. It was revelation. The truth was beginning to uncover itself, one unpaid bill at a time. And soon, Mabel would realize that every piece of her comfort had been standing on her son's silent sacrifice. The night of Alma's pre-wedding event was supposed to be a celebration of wealth and status. The hall glittered with chandeliers. The tables were full of flowers, and waiters moved quickly between guests carrying trays of champagne. Mabel walked in confidently, wearing a designer gown, her smile wide, pretending everything was perfect. But the moment she tried to pay the event planner, her face changed. The cards she swiped were declined. She fumbled with her wallet, trying one card after another, but nothing worked. The planner looked at her politely but firmly. "Ma'am, the payment hasn't gone through. I'm sorry, but we can't continue without payment." Mabel's smile froze. Guests around her whispered. Some tried to hide smirks. Others stared in surprise. Her social circle, people who once praised her lavish lifestyle, began mocking her quietly behind her back. They whispered about how the rich lady seemed suddenly powerless. The woman who had always been the queen of elegance and wealth was now embarrassed in front of everyone. As Mabel struggled to fix the situation, the crowd's attention shifted. The doors opened and Kofi walked in. He was wearing a crisp black suit, simple yet elegant. His steps were calm, almost quiet, but the atmosphere changed immediately. Guests turned to look, murmurs spreading through the hall. Everyone had read the morning news. Covalent Transports, the largest logistics company in Africa, had just gone viral for signing a massive international deal. The CEO's name was Kofi Mensah. Gasps echoed through the room. Some guests whispered to each other, "That's Kofi? The quiet one." Others looked at Mabel shocked. She turned pale, realizing the son she had always mocked was not just successful, but one of the most powerful men in the country. The same man who had been living simply, who drove an old car and never bragged, was now the center of attention. Kofi walked slowly toward the stage, greeting a few guests politely but without arrogance. His eyes met his mother's for a brief moment. She looked shocked, speechless, unable to comprehend that her useless son had become a man of immense power. The contrast was unbearable. While Mabel's credit cards had failed and her social image was cracking, Kofi's presence alone commanded respect. The whispers grew louder. People who had once laughed at him now stared in awe. Kofi's calm smile said more than any words could. In that moment, the tables had turned completely. The queen of wealth and mockery had fallen, and the quiet, useless son was finally seen for who he really was: unstoppable, respected, and undeniable. Later that night, after the event ended and the guests had left, Mabel found herself standing alone in the empty hallway of the mansion. Her heart was racing, and her hands trembled. She had tried to act calm in front of everyone, but inside she felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Every whisper, every stare, every shocked face replayed in her mind. And then she realized she needed answers. She had to confront Kofi. She walked quietly to the study where he waited, his posture relaxed, his calm presence filling the room. She shut the door behind her, and, for a moment, neither of them spoke. Her lips trembled, and her voice came out almost like a whisper, shaking with disbelief. You're the one behind Kovalink?" Kofi looked at her calmly. There was no anger, no gloating, only quiet strength. He nodded once, slowly. "Yes, Mom," he said. Then he leaned back slightly, his eyes steady. "And I am also the one who has been paying for your mansion, your trips, your charity events, and everything else you have enjoyed. Everything you thought you earned, everything you took pride in. It all came from me." Mabel's face turned pale. Her mouth opened, then closed, searching for words, but none came. She could feel her knees giving way beneath her, her legs trembling. All the pride she had carried for decades, the pride of being the wealthy, successful mother, the queen of her social circle, crumbled in an instant. She had spent her life mocking him, humiliating him, calling him useless, never realizing that the very foundation of her comfort and status had been built by the son she scorned. For the first time, Mabel had nothing to say. Her usual arrogance, her sharp tongue, her need to control the room, all gone. She stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of every insult she had thrown at him, every harsh word that now seemed foolish and cruel. Kofi remained quiet, letting the truth sink in, letting her see that her world had been built on his silent strength, his hidden sacrifice. Mabel's pride had collapsed completely. She realized she had been blind, that the useless child she had looked down on was the one who had carried her family without anyone knowing. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain herself, but nothing came out. All that remained was shock, guilt, and the bitter truth. Kofi had unmasked everything, and now she had no power, no words, no excuses left. The next morning, the news broke like wildfire. Social media was filled with headlines screaming, "Mother who called son useless discovers he funded her luxury lifestyle." Videos of Amma's pre-wedding event, Mabel's embarrassment at the declined cards, and Kofi's calm entrance circulated everywhere. People couldn't stop sharing the story. Comments flooded in, expressing shock, admiration for Kofi, and disbelief at how someone could be so quietly powerful while being mocked for years. Reporters didn't wait. Cameras and microphones appeared outside the family mansion, flashes going off as journalists tried to get interviews. Mabel paced inside, furious and confused, shouting at staff and friends alike. Everyone wanted answers, but no one could explain how the family's wealth had vanished, and who was behind the sudden exposure. The scandal didn't stop at social media. Amma's fiancé's family called off the wedding immediately. They didn't want their son marrying into a family now seen as disgraced and untrustworthy. Invitations were cancelled, caterers refunded, and the hall that had been booked for the big day sat empty. The family that once flaunted wealth now faced public shame. Meanwhile, Kofi gave his first interview to a major news channel. He appeared calm, composed, and polite. He didn't yell, he didn't insult his mother, and he didn't brag. Instead, he spoke slowly, letting his words sink in. "Sometimes people see silence as weakness," he said, his voice steady. "But silence often hides the strongest storms." The interview went viral instantly. Clips were shared millions of times. People admired his patience, his restraint, and the quiet power he had shown. While Mabel had used insults and humiliation to feel superior, Kofi had let his actions speak louder than words. The world saw a man who had been underestimated, mocked and treated unfairly, yet he had stayed calm and collected, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. Everywhere, the story became a lesson about respect, family, and patience. People tagged friends, wrote articles, and made memes about how someone called useless had quietly been the reason behind all the luxury and comfort. Kofi's calm presence, his composed smile, and his wisdom about silence captivated audiences. In that moment, Kofi's life had changed forever, but not because of revenge or anger. It was because the world finally saw him for who he truly was, strong, wise, and unstoppable. His silence had become louder than all the insults, and everyone knew that the useless son was the real power behind the family's story. Weeks passed, and the storm around Kofi and his family slowly settled. Kofi continued his work quietly, running Kovalink transports, while the world still talked about his calm power and the truth he had revealed. Then one afternoon there was a knock on his office door. Standing there was Mabel. She looked smaller, older, and broken. Her designer clothes hung loosely, her face pale, and her eyes full of shame. The confident woman who had once ruled her world with pride was gone. "Kofi," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I came to say I'm sorry." Her words were heavy, filled with regret. She took a step closer, unsure, as if afraid he would refuse to listen. Kofi didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, calm and still, his eyes steady. He could see the guilt in her expression, the fear that came from finally realizing how wrong she had been. He remembered every insult, every cruel word she had said over the years. Yet he felt no anger now. His silence was patience, his patience was strength. Slowly, Kofi reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a plain envelope. He handed it to her without a word. Mabel opened it and gasped. Inside was the deed to the family house, the only property Kofi had not reclaimed. All the other assets, the luxurious cars, the money, the accounts, he had taken back. But this, he decided, she could keep. "This is yours," he said calmly. "I've already paid for peace. I don't need revenge." His words were gentle but firm. There was no pride, no anger, just clarity. Mabel's knees gave way, and she sank into the nearest chair. Tears streamed down her face as she realized what she had lost. It wasn't just the money or the luxury life that had been gone. It was something far more important: Kofi's love and respect. For years, she had treated him like nothing, but even then he had silently carried the family, protected her, and ensured she had comfort. And now, all she could feel was sorrow for her arrogance, shame for her cruelty, and the emptiness left by his absence. Kofi turned and walked away, leaving her in silence. She watched him go, sobbing, knowing that her apology came too late. She had lost her son's love, the one thing no money or wealth could ever replace. In that quiet office, the truth was clear. Kofi had forgiven, but her place in his heart was now only a memory of what could have been. Months later, Kofi stood on a large stage at a packed youth empowerment summit. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. He wore a simple suit, his presence calm but commanding. For years he had been quiet, unnoticed, and underestimated. Yet here he was, proof that patience, hard work, and resilience could change everything. The audience leaned forward, sensing that his story was more than just business success. It was about courage, dignity, and quiet strength. Kofi began speaking slowly, choosing his words carefully. "They called me useless because I didn't fit their idea of success," he said, his voice steady. "They didn't see the value in a life that was quiet, simple, and different. But true success is not about showing off or seeking approval. True success is building quietly, working in silence, until even your silence speaks for you." The room was still for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then a wave of applause began, growing louder and louder, until the entire hall erupted. Phones were raised everywhere, recording, live streaming, and sharing his words. Social media exploded. Kofi's story went viral almost instantly. Children and teens, many who had been labeled failures by their parents or teachers, shared his message, inspired by the proof that patience, resilience, and quiet determination could lead to greatness. People across the world wrote comments, reposted videos, and tagged friends. His calm, humble delivery, combined with the undeniable truth of his journey, touched hearts everywhere. He had shown that being underestimated was not a curse but an opportunity. an opportunity to grow, build, and shine in ways others could never expect. As the summit ended and the lights began to dim, Kofi stepped back from the microphone. The audience continued clapping, some standing, some wiping tears. He looked up at the ceiling for a moment, breathing in the silence of victory, then whispered softly to himself, "I wasn't useless. I was just unseen, until it was time to be undeniable." In that quiet moment he felt peace. Not revenge, not anger, but the satisfaction of knowing that years of quiet work, patience, and strength had finally spoken louder than any insult. Kofi had shown the world that silence could be the strongest force, and that sometimes, being unseen was just the first step toward being unstoppable.